The room fell into a strange, heavy silence after that single word was spoken. It wasn't loud and it wasn't shouted, but it landed like a slap across the face of every man who understood what respect meant in that world. Muhammad Ali did not move. He did not blink. He stood there, tall, calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes steady, not burning with anger, but glowing with something far more dangerous, certainty. The men around him expected an explosion, a reaction, a mistake. They did not get one. What they did not realize was that the most powerful people in the room were not the ones holding cigars or guns, but the ones holding their silence. Outside the building, the city breathed like it always did, horns blaring, footsteps echoing, life continuing, unaware that a line had just been crossed that could not be erased. News traveled fast in that world, not through newspapers or radios, but through looks, whispers, and favors owed. Within minutes, the insult had already begun its journey through Harlem, through back rooms and barber shops, through places where men spoke softly but listened hard. And at the center of that invisible network sat a man who had built his reputation not on rage, but on memory. A man who never forgot who was humiliated and who did the humiliating. Bumpy Johnson was not present when the word was spoken, and that was precisely why it mattered. Everyone in that city knew one rule. When Bumpy was silent, he was listening. When he listened, he calculated. And when he calculated, entire families felt the consequences years later and never understood why their luck had suddenly turned. He did not rush to defend honor with fists or bullets. He defended it with patience, timing, and an understanding of power that went deeper than fear. To him, respect was currency, and someone had just counterfeited it. When the message finally reached him, it came through a man who spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it could explode in his mouth. Bumpy did not interrupt. He did not raise an eyebrow. He did not ask questions. He simply leaned back, folded his hands, and stared at the ceiling as though he were counting something only he could see. Those who knew him well understood this was the moment to be afraid, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Silence in Bumpy's world was never empty. It was full of decisions. He thought of Muhammad Ali not as a fighter, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol, a man who stood tall in a world that tried to keep him small, a man whose confidence unsettled those who believed power was inherited rather than earned. The insult was not just personal, it was strategic. It was meant to reduce, to remind, to place someone in their place, and Bumpy despised that more than anything. He had built his life dismantling invisible cages, and he recognized one instantly when he saw it. That night, Bumpy walked through Harlem as if nothing had changed, greeting shop owners, nodding to elders, listening more than he spoke. But behind his calm exterior, a map was forming. Names connected to names, favors to debts, weaknesses to ambitions. He knew the Genovese family did not act without calculation. If they allowed that word to be spoken publicly, it meant they believed no one would challenge it. That belief, Bumpy decided, was the real insult. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali sat alone later that evening, the noise of the day finally fading. He replayed the moment, not with anger, but with clarity. He understood exactly what the word was meant to do. He had faced it before, in different forms, in different rooms, dressed up as jokes, smiles, or authority. What made this moment different was not the insult itself, but the eyes watching to see how he would carry it. And so he carried it the same way he carried himself, upright, unbroken, unbowed. The first shift came quietly, a meeting canceled, a delivery delayed, a door that once opened easily now required knocking twice. Small things, barely noticeable on their own, but devastating when they began to stack.
The Genovese family was used to fear opening their doors, not closing them. They dismissed the changes as coincidence at first, then as incompetence, then as betrayal. What they did not see was the hand guiding the chaos, turning their own certainty against them. Bumpy never announced a war. He never needed to. He understood that real war was not declared, it was felt. It lived in uncertainty, in sleepless nights, in the sudden realization that control was slipping and no one could explain why. He sent no threats, made no speeches, demanded no apologies. He simply adjusted the balance of the city, tilting it just enough that those who had spoken carelessly began to feel weight where there had once been comfort. And through it all, Muhammad Ali remained untouched, not because he was hidden, but because he was visible, protected not by shadows, but by presence. Every public appearance became a statement, every calm smile a reminder. The insult that was meant to shrink him instead magnified him, and that irony cut deeper than any retaliation ever could. The Genovese family would soon understand that they had not insulted one man, they had challenged an idea, and ideas, once defended by men who understand patience, do not fade quietly. They demand acknowledgement, and if they are denied, they collect interest. By the time the family began to sense the shape of what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. They had mistaken silence for weakness, dignity for submission, and restraint for fear, and in doing so, they had awakened something far more dangerous than anger, a calculated response built on memory, respect, and the unspoken rule that some lines, once crossed, redraw the entire map.
By the time the Genovese family began to openly discuss the strange resistance forming around them, the city had already shifted in ways that statistics and ledgers could not explain. Their numbers still looked strong on paper, their names still carried weight in certain rooms, but something essential had thinned out: loyalty. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that shows up on time, keeps its word, and looks the other way when necessary. Men who once answered calls immediately now claimed delays. Messages that used to travel smoothly began returning distorted or unanswered. In a world built on control, confusion was the first real crack in the foundation. Bumpy Johnson watched all of this from a distance that made him invisible to those who were looking in the wrong direction. He understood that power did not need to be seen to be effective. It needed only to be felt. He did not move pieces aggressively, he moved them subtly, nudging circumstances just enough that the Genovese family began to make mistakes of their own. Pressure does not destroy structures immediately. It reveals where they were already weak. And Bumpy was patient enough to let those weaknesses speak for themselves. Muhammad Ali, meanwhile, became something unexpected in the middle of the storm: a mirror. Wherever he went, people watched him not just as a public figure, but as a test. Would he lower his eyes? Would he soften his voice? Would he adjust himself to fit the comfort of others? He did none of those things. His calm presence became quietly defiant, not loud enough to provoke, but steady enough to unsettle. Every handshake, every smile, every moment of dignity without apology amplified the original insult until it reflected back on those who had spoken it. What was meant to belittle now exposed insecurity. The Genovese family attempted to reassert dominance in the only ways they knew how: meetings, warnings, reminders of history. But history is only useful when it still commands belief, and belief had begun to fracture. Younger men within their circle questioned strategies that relied on fear rather than influence. Older men sensed that the city no longer leaned toward them the way it once had. They searched for the source of the shift, but power rarely announces its address. It operates through absence as much as presence, and the absence of certainty is often more terrifying than direct opposition. Bumpy did not rush the moment. He knew that real consequences arrived best when the target began to doubt itself. He allowed small victories to accumulate on the other side of the city, let confidence grow quietly among those who had once been cautious. Harlem breathed differently now, not loudly, not rebelliously, but with a steadier rhythm. People walked with a fraction more confidence, spoke with a fraction more assurance. These were not dramatic changes, but they were irreversible ones. Momentum, once gained, does not ask permission to continue. Inside the Genovese ranks, suspicion replaced trust. Men watched each other more closely. Conversations became shorter, less honest. Every setback demanded a culprit, and every culprit created resentment. This internal erosion was precisely what Bumpy anticipated. He understood that external enemies could be united against, but internal doubt was corrosive. It consumed from within, turning strength into paranoia. And paranoia, unlike fear, does not obey orders. Muhammad Ali felt the weight of the moment in quieter ways. There were nights when the silence pressed heavier than any crowd ever could. He knew he was being watched, evaluated, used as a symbol whether he asked for it or not. Yet he refused to shrink under that weight. Instead, he treated it as responsibility. He spoke with intention, carried himself with clarity, and never once addressed the insult directly. That restraint denied his opponents the reaction they needed to justify themselves. Silence, again, proved more powerful than confrontation. As weeks passed, the Genovese family began to realize that the issue was no longer the man they had insulted, but the response they could not control. The city was no longer reacting to them, it was responding to something else, something steadier, something patient, something that did not need to shout to be heard. Their attempts to reclaim narrative only highlighted how much of it they had already lost. The more they pushed, the clearer it became that the ground beneath them was no longer solid. Bumpy Johnson finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. Not satisfaction, he was not interested in victory for its own sake, but confirmation. The lesson had taken root. Respect, once violated, demanded correction, not revenge. Correction restored balance, revenge only fed chaos. He knew the Genovese family would soon be forced into a decision, acknowledge the shift quietly or escalate and expose themselves further. Either choice favored patience over impulse, and patience was not something they handled well under pressure. The city waited without realizing it was waiting. Conversations paused mid-sentence when certain names were mentioned. Doors opened a little slower. Eyes lingered a little longer. These were the signals of a story approaching its turning point. Not with violence, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. The kind of inevitability that arrives when too many small truths align to be ignored. And somewhere in that widening silence, the original word, the insult meant to diminish, lost all its power. Not because it was forgiven, but because it had been transformed. It no longer defined the man it was aimed at. Instead, it defined the weakness of those who believed it could. That realization, once it settled in, would change everything.
The moment the Genovese family realized they were no longer reacting to events, but being shaped by them, something fundamental shifted inside their ranks. Confidence, once effortless, now required rehearsal. Meetings that used to end with certainty dissolved into circular debates where no decision felt correct and every option carried risk. They were no longer commanding the rhythm of the city, they were chasing it. And chasing power is the surest sign that it has already begun to slip away. Bumpy Johnson remained precisely where he always was, visible enough to be known, distant enough to be untouchable. His greatest strength was never intimidation, but comprehension. He understood people the way others understood numbers. He could sense when fear hardened into pride, when loyalty thinned into habit, when habit collapsed into doubt. The Genovese family, proud of their legacy, failed to recognize that legacy only protects those who adapt. History does not defend stagnation, it exposes it. Bumpy allowed them to confront that truth on their own terms, knowing that self-realization is far more devastating than accusation. Muhammad Ali, increasingly aware of the larger forces orbiting around him, chose a path that confused both allies and adversaries: consistency. He did not change his tone. He did not adjust his message. He did not perform resilience for an audience. Instead, he embodied it quietly, day after day, until dignity became ordinary and therefore unstoppable. People stopped asking whether he would break because he gave them no evidence that breaking was possible. In doing so, he removed himself from the center of the conflict while remaining its moral axis, a position far more powerful than confrontation ever could be. The Genovese family attempted one final recalibration, a controlled display meant to remind the city of old hierarchies. But displays require belief to function, and belief was no longer guaranteed. The response they received was not defiance, but indifference, the most dangerous reaction of all. Indifference does not argue, does not threaten, does not resist. It simply redirects attention elsewhere. And attention, once withdrawn, is almost impossible to reclaim. Within their own organization, fractures widened. Long-standing alliances strained under pressure as men began prioritizing self-preservation over collective identity. Conversations once held in confidence leaked unintentionally through tone and timing. A delay here, a hesitation there, small betrayals disguised as caution. Bumpy had predicted this erosion not because he engineered it directly, but because he understood human behavior under sustained uncertainty. Fear unites briefly. Uncertainty divides indefinitely. Harlem, sensing the shift without needing explanation, leaned into a new equilibrium. It was not a rebellion, not a declaration, not even a movement. It was simply alignment. People adjusted their expectations, their partnerships, their trust. They gravitated toward stability, toward consistency, toward leadership that did not demand submission in exchange for protection. Bumpy's influence expanded not through force, but through reliability. In a chaotic environment, the most reliable presence becomes the strongest one. Muhammad Ali noticed the change most clearly in the eyes of strangers. Where there had once been curiosity mixed with skepticism, there was now recognition without entitlement. He was no longer being assessed, he was being accepted, not as a symbol of conflict, but as proof that composure could outlast provocation. That realization grounded him. It reminded him that dignity, when sustained long enough, stops being a response and becomes a standard. The Genovese family's leadership faced an impossible choice: escalate and risk exposure, or withdraw and concede influence. Neither option aligned with their identity, which had been built on dominance without compromise. But dominance, once questioned, demands constant reinforcement, and constant reinforcement drains resources, loyalty, and credibility. Bumpy understood that they were trapped not by his actions, but by their own self-image. They could not adapt without admitting weakness, and they could not maintain strength without adaptation. The paradox tightened around them. As the weeks progressed, the city settled into a quieter tension, the kind that precedes resolution. No dramatic confrontations erupted, no public declarations were made. Instead, decisions happened behind closed doors, routes quietly changed, priorities subtly rearranged. The Genovese family's presence receded, not with collapse, but with dilution. Influence does not vanish overnight. It thins until it is no longer decisive. That thinning was now undeniable. Bumpy Johnson watched the balance restore itself without celebration. To him, this was never about conquest, it was about correction.
a reminder that words carry weight, that dignity has allies even when it stands alone, and that power misused invites recalibration. He knew the final phase was approaching, not an ending, but an acknowledgement, the kind that does not announce defeat, but quietly accepts a new order. And in that acceptance, the original insult lost its final echo. It no longer belonged to the moment it was spoken. It had become a lesson absorbed by the city itself, that underestimating calm strength is the most expensive mistake any power can make.
By the time the final adjustment took place, it did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like the city exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. The Genovese family did not announce a retreat, nor did they issue explanations or seek reconciliation. Their presence simply softened, like a shadow shrinking at dusk. Certain territories grew quieter. Certain conversations stopped happening altogether. Power did not change hands with drama or destruction. It redistributed itself naturally, settling where consistency and restraint had already prepared the ground. Those who understood the language of influence recognized the shift immediately. Those who did not would spend years wondering when control slipped away. Bumpy Johnson received no formal acknowledgement, and he did not expect one. Recognition, to him, was not measured in praise, but in outcomes. The city functioned more predictably now. Tensions that once simmered unpredictably gave way to an order that felt less imposed and more accepted. People adjusted their expectations without being told to do so. That quiet acceptance was the clearest signal that balance had been restored. Bumpy had not expanded his reach, he had refined it, and refinement, unlike force, leaves no visible scars. Muhammad Ali stood at the center of the story's moral conclusion without ever stepping into its spotlight. The world around him had changed, yet he remained exactly as he had been at the beginning, composed, deliberate, unbroken. He never demanded vindication, never referenced the insult, never sought validation. In doing so, he allowed the lesson to speak louder than any declaration ever could. The word that once aimed to reduce him now lingered only as a reminder of how easily arrogance exposes itself when met with dignity. Those who observed the entire sequence closely began to understand something deeper about power and respect. True authority does not rush to defend itself, it does not overreact, and it does not need to humiliate in order to assert dominance. It corrects imbalance by restoring perspective. Bumpy Johnson's influence lay not in how loudly he could respond, but in how precisely he could reposition reality itself. He never erased his opponents, he rendered their assumptions obsolete. Within the Genovese family, the aftermath unfolded quietly. Men recalibrated ambitions, younger members sought stability elsewhere. Older ones reflected on how a single misjudgment, born of casual disrespect, had initiated a sequence they could neither predict nor control. The lesson was not recorded in books or meetings, but it was absorbed nonetheless. In a world obsessed with appearing powerful, they had underestimated the cost of appearing small. Harlem continued forward, carrying the memory not as resentment, but as wisdom. The community did not celebrate victory, it internalized the principle. Respect, once violated, does not always demand retaliation. Sometimes it demands demonstration, proof that dignity does not require permission to exist. That understanding strengthened the social fabric more than any confrontation ever could. Bumpy Johnson returned to his routines, walking familiar streets, exchanging familiar greetings, blending into the environment he had helped stabilize. His work was done not because someone had surrendered, but because the city had realigned itself around a truth it could no longer ignore.
He understood that influence, when exercised correctly, does not announce completion. It simply becomes invisible again. Muhammad Ali carried the experience forward as quiet reinforcement of something he already knew. Strength is not always loud. Courage is not always reactive, and the most enduring victories are the ones that leave no wounds behind, only clarity. Wherever he went afterward, he carried that clarity with him, not as a story to be told, but as a presence to be felt. In the end, nothing about the city looked dramatically different, and that was precisely the point. Power that functions best is the kind that allows life to continue without disruption. The insult that once threatened to diminish a man had instead reshaped an entire landscape of influence, not through force, but through restraint. And that transformation, quiet and irreversible, became the true conclusion. Not a war remembered for its battles, but a correction remembered for its lesson. That dignity, once tested and held, becomes untouchable.